Hello and welcome to the New Voice of Ukraine's series of questions and answer interviews and explainers, where we take a relevant topic of the week and have either our own staff, as is the case this week, or an invited guest answer some of your questions about it. These questions are asked on our Patreon page, so patreon.com/nvua, where we will make announcements for these interviews and ask you, our generous subscribers, the opportunity to figure out what your own questions are, what you want to know about something relevant to Ukraine. The New Voice of Ukraine is one of Ukraine's premier English language independent news sources. We are on the ground and have been for many years through revolution and war. So if you would like to join us and support Ukrainian independent journalism, patreon.com/nvua, or go to our site at english.nv.ua. The topic this week is a bit delayed. I'll explain it, but it will be about the status of Christianity, the Christian religion, the Christian demographics within Ukraine. Now, this was originally meant to be for Easter, a bit more relevant, a bit later now. However, I broke my nose, and so that had to be put on hold. And seeing how it's still broken, if my voice sounds slightly odd, that would be why. But yes, so regarding Christianity in Ukraine, though I myself am not a Christian, I am a longtime religion reporter in Ukraine. There are some weaknesses to reporting on religion in general, and that is I can talk about the political aspects, the historical aspects, the social aspects, but ultimately religion is a matter of personal faith, belief, and personal relationship with whatever your conception of the divine may be, and therefore what I will speak of will not cover the full extent of what Christianity will mean to Ukrainians. For that, you have to speak to Ukrainians personally. So with that disclaimer in mind, let us get started. And I think a good opening question that we can cover right now is, how did Christianity come to Ukraine and in what form? And for Ukraine, it is a bit of a funny story, really. It's originally recorded in what's called the Primary Chronicle. It is, like many medieval texts, more legend than reality, but it is instructive, I believe. And just because it is a bit of a funny story within the Primary Chronicle, the story of the Christianization of Ukraine goes back to the Middle Ages, when most peoples were leaving paganism behind. And so Volodymyr the Great, whose people were Slavic pagan at that time, had to make a decision of which religion he would join up with. And so the three options put in front of Volodymyr the Great were Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. With Judaism, he said that because they had lost their homeland, they no longer had God's favor. With Islam, a lot of Muslim powers in the area, especially the Volga Bulgars, that would have been a good way to fit into the local political scene. But he said that the Muslims do not eat pork and they do not drink alcohol, and alcohol is, quote, the joy of the Rus, and therefore could not make that choice. And so the last option available, Christianity, he had been to Constantinople, he had seen the beauty of its churches, thought that he was walking on heaven on earth, and so chose that as the religion of his people. Of course, the story is much more complicated than that. It was a long process. There's a series of missionaries and political concerns and all that led to this adoption. But that's the story in the medieval chronicles. Now, this form of Christianity would become Orthodoxy. Eastern Orthodox Christianity, the more Greek form of Christianity as opposed to the Western Latin Catholic version. This is a version of Christianity that deals a lot more with mysticism than that in the West, more monasticism. And so there are some differences in the practice of Christianity that an American, our American audience may not be as familiar with unless they live around certain ethnic groups, such as Greeks, Romanians, or Ukrainians, of course. And so this religion, some of its differences include the use of icons. If you go to an Orthodox service, it's more standing. There's not chairs to sit at that you may be used to in the West. And there's a lot more ritual involved. So especially if you compare it to Protestantism, which is based a lot more around homiletics, around preaching, about kind of the speech the pastor gives. If you go a bit further on that spectrum, you hit Catholicism, which is much more ritualistic, and then Orthodoxy is even more ritualistic than that. So a Orthodox church service, if you go to one, there's lots of singing, incense. It's more of a transcendent feel, I think you can say they're going for, as opposed to the other end of that spectrum, Protestantism, where it's much more down to earth and communal and about like the people there. And the other historical note is the question of what is the Orthodox Church in Ukraine? And that is ultimately what the rest of this discussion will be about, is to a large extent the role of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine as opposed to especially the Russian Orthodox Church. A lot of our political questions and demographic questions will focus on that. So let's get that right out the gate to cover it. And how it worked is that through most of the several hundred years of Russian control over most of Ukrainian territory, that was also accompanied by rule of the Russian Orthodox Church. That changed ultimately in 2019. Quite recently. Now, there were events that led up to it. There were many attempts throughout the years to reestablish a local Ukrainian church independent from Russia. There were versions of this that happened in the first era of independence in 1917, for example. But most of these attempts were forced underground, especially during the Soviet Union. And then after Ukrainian independence, the Kiev Patriarchate, as it is called, did not have the full recognition of other Orthodox churches, did not have the same level of independence and respect that, say, the Romanian Orthodox Church would, because it was not universally recognized. This changed in 2019. And there was a bit of legal complications about that if you look at Orthodox law. So if we look back, hundreds of years ago, the ecumenical patriarchate, the guy in charge in Constantinople, he's not a pope, but the first among equals is the terminology for it. The most important person, you can say, within Orthodoxy, but he does not have direct control over anything in the way that the pope would in Catholicism. And the argument goes, made by the ecumenical patriarch, is that he did not grant Russia control over Ukrainian territory, just a kind of temporary custodianship as the Russian Empire was in charge. And that because this was only a temporary measure, it can be undone. So the ecumenical patriarch, Bartholomew, made the decision that the Ukrainian church is under him directly, which is how this kind of goes in Orthodoxy. And as the person in charge of Orthodoxy in Ukraine, he had the power to grant Ukraine independence. So technically speaking, Ukrainian church did not gain independence from Russia. It gained independence from Constantinople. I have gone into much more detail about this many times in the past in my various reporting about the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, but that's the division. And the main thing important there is that when you think Orthodox Church of Ukraine, that is the local church, is the church that most Ukrainians belong, loyal to the country, we can say. The main competitor there is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate, which is the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. Okay, so we have these terms. We have Orthodox Church of Ukraine, that is Orthodoxy based out of Ukraine, and Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate, based out of Moscow. So these are our differences. But before we get into what those differences are politically, and honestly can kind of guess what they would be, the relationship of Ukraine with Russian organization of any variety during this war of Russian aggression, you can guess what that relationship would be. But first, let's look at what the other forms of Christianity in Ukraine are. So what are the demographics? Ukrainian Christendom. And the first number we can start off with is that Ukraine is a very Christian country. It is very, very overwhelmingly Christian, I'd say. So our first number here is from the Kiev International Institute of Sociology from a study in 2022. There are other numbers that will vary from what I will tell you, but the differences aren't much. So what I'm about to say, plus minus a few, you'll get it. So according to this survey in 2022 from the Kiev International Institute of Sociology, 85% of Ukrainians are Christian of one variety or another. They consider themselves to be Christians. The second largest group would be the non-religious people, and then other groups, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, etc., are small percentages. Now, again, Orthodoxy, I mentioned the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. According to this survey, a majority of Ukrainians belong to this church. 54% of Ukrainians belong to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, and a much smaller number, which is quite a difference from how it was a few years ago, the Moscow Patriarchate only has 4%. So 4 or 5% of the population of Ukraine. Again, they're surveyed by this study in 2022, which does not have access to the occupied territories, it's important to say, are followers of the Moscow Patriarchate. So once upon a time, this number was closer to about 20%, higher than 20%. Now it's down to 4%. I'll go into why later on. And then the third group here is the Just Orthodox. This may be including some of the ethnic Orthodox churches, especially the Romanian, possibly. But my guess is that a lot of the Just Orthodox people are parts of the Moscow Patriarchate, but do not identify with it. So the closest church to me in my neighborhood, short 10-minute walk away, is Moscow Patriarchate. But every once in a while, people will notice that there will be some petition passed around to move this church to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Kind of peters out every once in a while. And the people that go to this church are not so attached to the idea of being Moscow Patriarchate. They would probably just consider themselves to be just Orthodox. But that is the Orthodox Church that is closest to where they live, so that's the one that they go to. So that's Orthodoxy. 54% Orthodox Church of Ukraine, 4% Moscow Patriarchate, 14% anything else. And the next largest group of Christians are the Catholics. So Catholicism has a more complicated history in Ukraine. If we look back to the year 1585, we have what's called the Union of Brest, where the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church made a decision to get back together. This was very short-lived. There was a lot of people who were not happy about this, and so it dissolved rather quickly. However, in the Ukrainian lands, they were part of Poland at the time, part of the Polish Republic. The Poles basically offered the Ukrainians, look, you can keep most of your rituals, most of your aesthetics, most of your ways of practicing your faith. Just join the Catholic Church and listen to the Pope. There was a priest at the funeral of Pope Francis, and I saw a lot of online commentators thinking that they were Orthodox because their vestments, their practices looked Orthodox. Like they were not, they're Catholic. So 8% of Ukrainians belong to this Greek Catholic Church. Very large regional differences. It is a majority in the Lviv region. It is also very large in Ternopil and Ivano-Frankivsk. And while Greek Catholicism exists elsewhere in the country, it is much, much smaller outside of this region called Galicia, which has more history being under Polish rule, and so more Catholic influences. However, if we look at Kyiv, the church just up the hill from Maidan is a Catholic church that is done in Polish language. On the left bank of Kyiv, a bit further away from the center. So if you're visiting Kyiv, you may not see it at all because it is outside of the normal kind of tourist route in the center, but that is the headquarters in Kyiv of the Greek Catholic Church. It is a pretty nice big building, has some gardens around it. But the remaining part of Catholic Church. There are some Catholics who are Latin Rite Catholics, which is what you're probably more used to in the West. Most of our viewers in the West, so I'm just using that reference point. So 1% of Ukrainians are Latin Catholic. And these are mostly ethnic minorities, primarily Hungarians, though there are also still some ethnic Polish people in Ukraine who would follow Latin Rite Christianity. And rounding off our demographic section, Protestantism, 4% of Ukrainians most of these are Baptist. Now, Ukraine historically does have a Protestant community. There are a lot of Mennonites, for example, in what's now the Zaporizhia region, Donbass. There are Swedish communities in the south, other Germans. And so historically there was Protestantism, but that was mostly destroyed in the tragic events of the 20th century. German occupation, as well as Soviet ethnic and religious policy, mostly wiped out those ethnic Protestant communities. There were Protestants who continued to practice throughout the Soviet era. That was mostly underground, but the primary part of modern Ukrainian Protestants came in with the fall of the Soviet Union. A lot of Western, especially American Baptists, Baptists were a big part of it, came to Ukraine to try and to convert people, and were able to create a community that way. I already kind of pointed out my location as opposed to the Greek Catholic Church. On the opposite side of a bridge from me, there is a very large Baptist church where that looks exactly like you would think an Orthodox church one, with gorgeous blue domes and everything, but it's Baptist. And I think that's a very fascinating merger of cultures, this relatively new religion to Ukraine adopting the forms and aesthetics of local traditions. So those are the broad groups of how Christianity works in Ukraine. And with the one last thing that I should mention is that throughout the Soviet Union, where there was officially state atheism, many of these groups were banned. Catholicism, Greek Catholicism especially, was banned. Protestantism was banned. The only form of Christianity that could be practiced in the open was the Russian Orthodox Church, because the Russian Orthodox Church had been co-opted by the state. But that's an important historical note as well. So our next question that we can look at is, we have our numbers of how many people belong to this, but how religious of a country is Ukraine? How deep does Christian belief and identity feel? Like, what we covered the breadth, now let's look at the depth. And this is always a hard one to track, because that can change. And throughout any individual person's life, they will go up and down of how devout, how identifying they are to any faith. And there's a well-known problem in counting people's religiosity, in that people will over-report how religious they are. People, when asked how often you go to church, will often exaggerate how much they do on these studies. However, we can pretty confidently say that in Ukraine, roughly a quarter to a third of the population are actively religious. They belong to a religious organization. They regularly attend services of one form or another. And if you look at the holidays, that number goes up. So like I said, this is supposed to be released on Easter. On Easter, many more people will be involved in their church than any given Sunday. How religious they are, I would say that Ukrainians don't treat religion as a topic you discuss much in public. It's a very live and let live. Religion is a personal thing to you. Religion as a political force is quite weak, especially in the absence of Russian Orthodoxy. When Russian Orthodoxy was much stronger, it did lean into politics much more heavily. Although with the weakening of Russian Orthodoxy in Ukraine, that has to a large extent decreased with it. If you go around on buses, for example, there will be a religious icon hung up. Iconography is quite common, but that's what public religion is. That said, Ukrainians are generally a more religious people than on average, especially in Europe. And regionally, the west part of Ukraine is more religious, and the east part of Ukraine is less religious, and a fair bit of regional variation within that. I'd say that in the number I gave of church participation, quarter to a third is quite high. America is amongst the most practicing, so it isn't necessarily super practicing by an American standard. It's quite average by American standards, but compared to, say, the Czechia or Hungary or countries like that, it is more practicing. And we'll tie that into how has the war affected Christianity in Ukraine? So have people become more religious or less religious? And that is an interesting one in that religion is often people's comfort in times of difficulty, and it is part of your identity. And in a war such as this one, where Russia has really focused on destroying Ukrainian identity, and Russia has specifically aimed one of its goals as the destruction of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, I think what that does is that causes people to rally to who they are, to what they believe, and it isn't as though Ukraine hasn't had a huge jump in church attendance. Those numbers haven't increased so much. I feel as though it is more of an appropriate topic to talk about than it was beforehand, especially passing through the Easter holiday, where a lot of the celebration of Easter is deeply connected to Ukrainian identity, to Ukrainian family traditions. People will seek refuge in their faith in these times. And the flip side of this, if we're talking about Russian Orthodoxy, and I told myself I wouldn't make everything a comparison with Ukrainian and Russian Orthodoxy here, but the influence of the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, I already gave the number. It is plummeted. And this has mostly been because many members of the Russian Orthodox Church, as a result of this war, they said that we can no longer associate with, anything Russian. And so whole congregations left the Russian Orthodox Church for Ukrainian Orthodoxy. This was something that they chose on their own, and it's because a lot of people simply didn't know, they simply did not trust a Russian Orthodox Church to a large extent. And the other part of that is many people who were adherents of the Russian Orthodox Church lived in the East, and they became refugees. When you are a refugee, that means severing your relationship with your home community in a violent and tragic way. And the reason for why many of these people were part of the Russian Orthodox Church was that was simply what was available to them. Well, the church in their village, in their town, in their neighborhood was Russian Orthodox, so they went there. Now they no longer lived in that village or neighborhood or town because the Russians destroyed it, and they had to either leave for a different part of the country or abroad. They lost that connection, and therefore they lost their adherence to Russian Orthodoxy. This is something that the Moscow Patriarchate Church in Ukraine has written about quite a bit, that they were very afraid, like their number one concern is losing membership because their members were all refugees. So that very direct experience with war, in the most direct way it can be, I had to leave here to go elsewhere, and that religion was no longer available to me to the place I went to. That's the most direct form of how war can affect religion that there can possibly be, just physical displacement. And I think that experience with war is an excellent segue into our next question is, what role did Orthodoxy have on Russia launching this war? Now, keep in mind, as I said, Orthodoxy, Christianity, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, is also the religion that most of Ukraine practices. So I'm not talking about the role of Orthodoxy as a religion, as a faith, as a thing that many people throughout the world practice. I mean specifically the Russian Orthodox Church, headed by the Moscow Patriarchate, Vladimir Gundyaev, and the ideology and choices of people associated with this specific organization. And Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, plays a far larger role in Russian war aims than is usually talked about. Now, this may just be me as a religion reporter being the guy saying that his particular specialty is more important, but let's be serious here. I'll lay out my case, and that is, if we look, well, I'll go in order here. So we'll look at the initial invasion in 2014, and then the full-scale invasion in 2022. What is the role that Orthodox Christianity played in these two phases? And it did play a larger role in 2014, but it is all in continuity. So in 2014, what we had was how the Russian invasion began was essentially a series of pro-Russian militias under the control of Russia, but decentralized and to a great extent disorganized and autonomous from each other. And many of these militias were very explicitly Orthodox and believed in an ideology, Orthodox supremacy, the suppression of all other faiths, and an officially Orthodox political system. Many of these militias were funded and indirectly organized by a man that is known as the Orthodox oligarch Konstantin Malafeyev. Konstantin Malafeyev is a fabulously wealthy Russian Orthodox oligarch who believes in spreading this idea in Russia and wherever else he can get his hands on of Orthodox Christianity as the guiding governmental system. Very deeply right-wing, deeply conservative, to the point of reactionary, of basically wanting to go back to the Russia of the imperial era. And he funded many of these militias. So you had the Black Hundreds, named after a very violent group from the early 20th century that killed a lot of Jews, the Russian imperial movement, and others that you can kind of dissect them further, but most of these militias were like this, the belief in Orthodox supremacy. And these are headed up by a man named Igor Girkin. Girkin was a Russian spy. He was involved in the wars in Chechnya, in Bosnia, and was deeply involved in these movements of Konstantin Malafeyev. He wrote in a extreme far-right violent newspaper publication shortly after the independence of Russia and the other republics from the Soviet Union. And it was this milieu that everything came out of. So when these militias run by Igor Girkin took over the city of Sloviansk and declared the Donetsk People's Republic, one of the first things they did was have a religious reign of terror. So one of the first acts committed by these terrorists of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic was kidnapping and murdering a group of Protestant priests. This was partly because they associated Protestantism with the West, but they also did not like Catholics one bit. Anti-Catholicism within this Russian Orthodox supremacist ideology goes back even farther than anti-Semitism in a way. Lots of anti-Catholic conspiracy theories became anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, actually. And so because they had these ideologies and they began to enact them, and because they're all very violent people, it led to a lot of people being killed because they had these beliefs. They were driven out of Sloviansk, which is when a lot of these things were discovered, and retreated to Donetsk, leading to everything that we have seen since then. But during the time of the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic's phase, where they pretended to not just be Russia and had a degree of autonomy to them, that also included a lot of religious persecution. There was one Vice story I remember about the underground Protestant churches that were operating in Donetsk during this time because they were being repressed, which leads to a kind of funny story about how these terrorist groups gave a measure of religious liberty. Is that other than these Orthodox supremacists, the other group involved in these militias was the neo-Nazi neo-pagans. And because these pagans wanted their own freedom of religion outside of Orthodox Christianity, they're able to lobby the terrorist authorities to grant a level of religious liberty because of that. So I guess what level of religious freedom existed in these Russian occupied eras came down to neo-Nazis asking for it. Another one of these groups that was involved is the Cossack movement, these people in Russia who dress up like 19th century Cossacks and do a lot of violent things against the LGBT community, against protesters, that kind of thing in Russia. They were also part of this war, and they also brought their ideas of Orthodox supremacy with them. So it's all very ingrained. And if we look to the 2022 full-scale invasion, as the occupation rule extended much further than the original Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics into the occupied regions of Zaporizhia, Kherson, and the remainder of the Donbass, as well as Crimea, had lots of its own religious persecution there. As this occupation zone expanded, it expanded the religious persecution. There have been many Catholic priests, many Protestant priests that have been kidnapped, tortured, and killed under occupation. There is a lot of opacity around how these occupation areas are governed. We don't have the same information that we might have had in the past. And because they are considered properly Russian and not these weird ideological militia something, I don't even know what to call what they were beforehand, they're not as ideological in those ways, but that's all very much part of the system there of religious persecution. And this is one thing that Ukrainians have tried to really impress on Americans, is that as Russia expands its area of control, it means a persecution of Christians. Any Christian who is not a part of the Russian Orthodox Church is suppressed. The degree of that suppression may vary from dirty looks to torture and execution, but it is not free by any imagination. And the role that the Russian Orthodox Church itself plays in this, not just Orthodox Christians who are part of these extremist groups, but the Russian Orthodox Church has indirectly, this is one of those things where it's hard to say what specifically it says depending on who releases what document, but I can say that there was a conference of Russian Orthodox officials slightly to the side. It's complicated, but all these people who made up the hierarchy of the Russian Orthodox Church released this document declaring the invasion of Ukraine to be a holy war. They explicitly set out that there's a war fought for religious purposes in order to destroy the heretical Christians of Ukraine, to eradicate the heresy of Ukrainians believing that they exist, to fight back at what they see as the encroachment of Western liberalism into Ukraine, and that if Ukraine liberalizes, then that is the next step to Russia being taken over and turned into, a liberal place, and they see that as the worst possible thing. So this is very explicitly a religious war, as declared by the Russian Orthodox Church. And to go even further than that, certain members of the Russian Orthodox Church have declared that your sins will be absolved by fighting in this war. That if you carry on this holy mission to wipe out the Ukrainian Orthodox, to wipe out the Catholics, to wipe out the Protestants, to wipe out the liberals, then your sins will be cleansed. That is quite literally what a crusade is, essentially. When the Catholic Church launched the Crusades, it was with the promise that you will be absolved of sin and you'll enter heaven cleansed. Because of that, that is what Russian Orthodoxy is offering, or at least some members of Russian Orthodoxy have offered. And when I explain this to people, they often don't get it because it's not covered as extensively, but it is something that it really does need to be focused on. But we can go on to our next questions. I think I've covered that pretty well. And the next topic I will talk about is the destruction of religious sites in Ukraine. This war has been very destructive. There are entire cities throughout the front line that have been essentially reduced to rubble. Most of Mariupol no longer exists. Bakhmut mostly no longer exists. There is a list of cities, just there is a list of people that we can mourn. And within those places, there were churches, there were religious sanctuaries that were destroyed along with them. So that's one reason why so many churches were destroyed, because everything was destroyed. Now, there's actually just recently a report from February about the extent of damage to Ukrainian religious sites. And allow me to quote this real quick to make sure I get the numbers correct. But since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, Russia has deliberately destroyed not only cities, infrastructure, and cultural heritage sites, but also religious buildings in Ukraine, according to the Ministry of Culture and Strategic Communications. As of February 2nd, 2025, Russian forces have damaged or completely destroyed 642 religious buildings. Of that, 596 of them were Christian churches. Now, of course, Ukraine, as a predominantly Christian country, most religious buildings that will be destroyed will be Christian ones. But these destructions are not only in frontline areas. There were some very prominent examples of churches being destroyed. Well, I'll start with one that is a frontline position. But the Svyatohirsk Monastery, Svyatohirsk Lavra, in the Donetsk region, is kind of the second most important religious site in Ukraine after the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, which is in Kiev in the center. You can see that quite easily here. But this Svyatohirsk Lavra is number 2. And that was at the front line. It was briefly occupied by the Russians, and it was in a very strategic position because it is located within the Holy Mountains, is what this mountain range is called, because it is sacred, has this monastery in it. And in Donetsk, a mostly flat area, these holy mountains were very strategic. So when Russia was able to capture them, they posed a very large threat to Donetsk region because of it, especially the city of Slovyansk, which is just outside of. Very lovely monastery, but it was to a large extent destroyed by the Russians. Not entirely. The last I have seen, at least the rubble has been cleaned up. Some parts of it have been restored. It is not looking as rough as it was looking in the immediate aftermath of its liberation from the Russians, but it was pretty damaged. And also a different church that is part of the same complex, a wooden church just north of it, was burned down by the Russians in a strike of some variety or another. That's probably the biggest one, but also in Odessa, very far from the front line, a Russian missile went right into what is probably the most important cathedral in the city, in the main park in the center of town. If you've been to Odessa, you've certainly seen this cathedral. A missile went through it. It caused a lot of damage. There's very interesting scenes where it kind of toppled over the altar, but it was blocked by the walls. It's a very kind of haunting imagery of this church that was knocked down but not completely destroyed. Kind of resonates. And I was there in the aftermath of that attack. I saw this for myself in this cathedral right in the center of the city, and a very interesting one because most Orthodox cathedrals tend to be a bit more dark on the inside, a bit more cavernous, whereas the Transfiguration Cathedral in Odessa looked more nautical, I guess you can say, because Odessa had a lot more light coming in than is usual for an Orthodox church. It was very lovely, and it was greatly destroyed. And the kicker here is both of the churches that I just mentioned, this Svyatohirsk Lavra and the Odessa Transfiguration Cathedral, they were both Moscow Patriarchate. I'll get into in this question coming up of the question of religious persecution and all that. But no one has done more damage to the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine than Moscow. They have bombed, I'd say, a disproportionate amount of these churches that were damaged or destroyed by the Russians were Moscow Patriarchate churches. This issue of cultural destruction as well, that's something else we can look into at a different time. In this next question will be, I think, the most important question that we'll go over this episode, and that is the one that has been on the lips of American politicians, Western commentators, most of the time for malicious purposes, I'd say. And that is, what is the status of religious freedom in Ukraine? And are any Christians or other religions being persecuted by the government? And quite frankly, no. There's no religious persecution. Now, this question, to take it seriously, and not just literally, will have to focus on the Moscow Patriarchate and how its members are treated in Ukraine. And that will mostly focus on, I'm going to go right towards the main question here, is this law that supposedly banned, as it stated, any religious organization that was run out of or connected to the aggressor country, Russia. So not specifically about the Russian Orthodox Church, but basically about the Russian Orthodox Church. There's really nothing else that fits that description. And so was the Moscow Patriarchate banned? And I think our easiest way to answer that is how I explained earlier in the episode, which is that the closest church to me is the Moscow Patriarchate Church. And no, it's not closed down. Still going. So no, the church was not actually banned. There is some confusion on that because I feel like a lot of Ukrainians and a lot of Ukrainian media, a lot of Ukrainian politicians presented it as banning the Russian Orthodox Church, but no, that never really happened, and for a very specific reason. It's a bit confusing, so bear with me. There's not actually such a thing as the Moscow Patriarchate. I'll explain. It's not one actual organization called the Moscow Patriarchate that exists as a singular legal entity that can be banned. What there is there's a lot of parishes, a lot of individual churches that affiliate with the Moscow Patriarchate, not a whole grand organization, but hundreds of these smaller ones. Therefore, what this law has to do is prove that any one of those individual organizations, any of those individual churches, individual parishes, individual charities, that they specifically are connected to Russia, which is also known as treason. But not many of them were. Now, the Moscow Patriarchate tries to say that none of it is, that they declared independence from the Russian Orthodox Church and are their own thing. However, the document saying this was never made public. And from an Orthodox point of view, that's not something that really exists. The only way to do that is to get what's called a tomos of autocephaly, which is what the Orthodox Church of Ukraine did in 2019, and this is something they did not do. So, and he claimed that the church as a whole became independent, dubious at best. But these individual churches, yeah, I can totally believe that random priest number 325 in this village did not have anything to do with Russia. Now, this is not the case for all of them. It is an unfortunate fact that in many cases, one of the most common sources of collaborators by Russia has been Russian Orthodox priests that worked directly with the Russian authorities and handed over lists of people for the Russian authorities to kill. So those churches would fall under this prescription, but many of those priests fled with the Russian army. Not all of them. There's still some complicated stories in the Kyiv countryside, we can say, regarding that. Don't have time for that right now. That's one thing that will require a lot more research in the future. Very sensitive. But those churches, yes, would fall under this categorization of working with the Russians and therefore can be banned. But what is bigger from their perspective is these major church properties. So I mentioned the Kiev Patriarchate, the Svat and these are things that were controlled by the Moscow Patriarchate, but they weren't owned by it. These were, legally speaking, national parks. They were public property that, because of their religious importance, were leased out to religious organizations. And in the case of the Kiev Patriarchate, the main monastery in Kiev, kind of the most famous part of the Kiev skyline, really, that had been controlled by the Moscow Patriarchate. However, the government essentially evicted them from state property and allowed the Orthodox Church of Ukraine to replace them. This was a minor controversy at the time, but did not lead to much, really. This was a controversy for a couple of months and has largely dissipated because in the course of these events, many of the clergy at the Kiev-Pечерsk Lavra were found to have Russian propaganda, Russian flags, Russian passports, along with other contraband, criminal contraband of the non-religious variety. But therefore, they did not exactly gain much public support. They were seen as a hostile element and therefore did not really have much popularity to defend themselves with. I was there for this handover. They tried to stage some protests, but without public support, protests can't really go anywhere. So the Kiev-Pечерsk Lavra is now in the hands of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And this issue of church properties was very, very important because that's where the money is. As I explained, Ukraine is a quite religious society and one that is actually more religious than Russia, and therefore the parishes within Ukraine had more tithing, more donations, more support from local people with money, and therefore Russia lost a major source of its incomes by losing the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. And that's really what they were mad about, in addition to their ideological aims of controlling Ukraine as an Orthodox country. But those are the main things. So no, a practicing Orthodox Christian can still go to church, but your church is not allowed to do treason. That should not be a surprise in a time of war. Don't do treason. Pretty straightforward. But to round off this discussion with a lighter topic, again, this is supposed to be their Easter episode until I broke my schnoz. So let's talk about some Easter traditions in Ukraine. I already mentioned that it's a very big public holiday. So on Easter Sunday, there were a lot of people out in the streets. This is something that we're used, like I explained earlier, it's a celebration of Ukrainian culture. So people were playing folk music. They were dressed up in their Ukrainian clothing. This shirt I have right now is not a traditional vyshyvanka, but it is a modern design based off of traditional embroidery. So this is all embroidered. Embroidery plays a very important role in Ukrainian national costume, very important role in Ukrainian national identity, and it's what you wear on holidays such as this. So it's interesting to walk around and everyone is in their vyshyvankas and their lovely embroidered dresses, and they go to the church with their basket that includes Pascha, this Easter bread. It's quite delicious. There's the more traditional kind that is often braided in quite intricate designs. And then there's the modern kind, which has like frosting over it with like a cake. But you take that to the church to be blessed by a priest, and people may go on to the Easter Mass, but the public part is why you hear most people talk about. It's the more fun part of the holiday to have this blessing over your Easter baskets. Easter eggs are also huge in Ukraine. Hold on, I'll try and find it. Yes, this is called a pisanka, an Easter egg. Now, this is not necessarily an egg, this is wood. The more traditional form of it is, of course, actual eggs, which will often initially be dyed using onion skins, and then it creates like this greenish color, yellowish greenish color, and then designed from there. If you come to Ukraine, if you go to the city of Kolomna in the Ivano-Frankivsk region, there is the Pisanka Museum. It's a museum that's shaped as a giant Easter egg, a bunch of giant Easter eggs outside. And if you go inside, you'll see Easter eggs from all regions of Ukraine and the history and the importance. Tourism in Ukraine is quite a complicated topic in itself, considering the inherent dangers of coming to a country at war. However, if you do come, that's one thing I do suggest going to is the Pisanka Museum in Kolomna. So like I said, there's music and public celebrations. It's one of the biggest holidays of the year. Unfortunately, I broke my nose on Easter, so the fun of it was a bit tampered by that, falling into the pavement while riding a scooter. Be careful when riding the scooter, everybody. But that was my Easter, a bit more damaging. Everyone else, however, it's a lovely holiday, and if you can be in Ukraine during any time of the year, that's a fantastic one to be a part of. And of course, it is different in different parts of the country. There are some differences between the Greek Catholics in the West and the Orthodox and most of the rest of the country, and then The Protestants have their own things. The other thing that kind of makes Ukrainian Easter a bit different from what I'm more familiar with in the United States is that there's a lot of rituals involving cleaning. So, of course, you're leaving the cold part of the year, entering the hot part of the year. And part of that is, of course, your spring cleaning. And that has been incorporated into the faith. The day after Easter Sunday is Wet Monday. And that involves throwing water on people, on things. And this is quite literally an act of purification, of cleansing, but also a spiritual act of cleansing altogether. The literal and the metaphorical bound together in the act of dousing people with water. There's also a lot of traditions in the week leading to Easter revolving around lighting fires. Historically, one way that you would disinfect things was with smoke from fires. So again, there's this quite literal understanding of a cleansing fire, but also metaphorical, the cleansing of the soul for the preparations for Easter. At the top, I mentioned that the spiritual aspects of religion is what's actually important, and the political aspects are just what I will cover as a journalist. But keep in mind, the spiritual is also quite key in these times. Though I am not myself a Christian, it's something I can appreciate as a member of a different faith, Judaism. So that closes off our questions and answers. This was our Easter special held after Easter. And again, I will apologize for the lateness. Could not really control what happened, but we will be doing another one this month. I have hopefully an interview in line for that. Again, so when that is announced, you can go to our Patreon at patreon.com/NVUA, get these prompts for the Q&A sessions. You will gain access to our newsletters and other premium content, and you will be supporting Ukrainian independent journalism. It's patreon.com/NVUA. To see more of our reporting, go to the New Voice of Ukraine in English, or if you speak Ukrainian, you can go to our Ukrainian site. It is primarily a Ukrainian language site. It is local media. So thank you all very much for listening. Thank you all very much for showing curiosity in this topic of immense importance in Ukraine. You'll find more of us later. Go back to our back catalog. There's some wonderful interviews in there. So until next time, Slava Ukraini.